We're now going to have a public hearing on proposed amendments to 19 TAC, Chapter 112, Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills for Science, Subchapter A, Elementary, Subchapter B, Middle School, and Subchapter C, High School. We have several testifiers today for all three of the items on our agenda, so we're going to keep moving along.
Two objections that we have to amendments that were made and passed in February, one having to do with complexity of the cell, which is 4A, the other having to do with the origin of DNA, which is 6A. And so the motion that you passed on 4A was compare and contrast prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells evaluate scientific explanations for the complexity, and we object to the term evaluate and wish it to read compare and contrast eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells, including scientific explanations for their complexity. In like manner, the one on DNA, we would like to get rid of the evaluate scientific explanations for the origin of DNA and replace that with identify scientific explanations for the origin of DNA. And we give several reasons in this letter why we feel this way, but one of the more important reasons that we don't mention in this letter is that when we completed our streamlining, we had eliminated some or deleted some 14 student expectations, and that freed up 18 days. And if you put evaluate back into these two, you're adding what my committee says is an additional 8 to 9 instructional days. So you're really adding back in half of the streamlining advantages of that elimination. So that is what our recommendation is, and I'll open it up to discussion.
Mr. Rowley.
Dr. Weatherington, thank you first for all your work with regard to the committee and otherwise. And I also want to thank you and appreciate, and I have a question here in just a moment.
Okay.
Thank you and appreciate the review committee's apparent ability to work with us in terms of coming up with satisfactory.
We appreciate that too.
Standards, great. And so I've got questions about what you're proposing here in your letter. With regard to 4A, my understanding is that that's the review committee's recommendation that the new text would read, compare and contrast prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, including scientific explanations for their complexity.
That is correct.
Right, okay. So if I were just to try to break this down a little bit, or at least maybe oversimplify it, would it be accurate to say that if this particular standard is adopted, that teachers would be instructed and certainly have freedom to teach a comparison and a contrasting of scientific explanations for the complexity. Oops, I guess my time was up. For the complexity of those cells. Is that right? Okay. Maybe your mic's off too as well, Dr. Weatherington. But and so would I be accurate? Would it be accurate to surmise that if this standard was written as the review committee is suggesting here, that Texas biology teachers would have the freedom to teach about and compare and contrast various scientific explanations for the complexity of cells, including evolution, but including others, so long as they're scientific.
They would not only have that opportunity, they would be required to do so because it's part of the student expectations.
Okay.
And as a matter of fact, you know, this is sort of redundant because if you're comparing and contrasting the most primitive cell and the most advanced cell, by definition, you're looking at their relative complexity. So to add that language explicitly is not a big deal.
Okay, very good. And so then if we look at 6A, again, you all are asking that instead of using the term evaluate the components of DNA and the scientific explanations for the origin of DNA, you're asking that the wording be identify scientific explanations for the origin of DNA.
And the reason we did that is because it starts out, identify components of DNA, and then identify how information, etc., is carried in DNA. So we just track the same language and identify scientific explanations for the origin of DNA.
Okay, so in your opinion, is it the opinion of the review committee as well, that if we were to word this standard as the review committee suggests, that once again, we would give teachers the freedom to look at, to identify, to teach about various scientific explanations for the origin of DNA, including evolution, but others as well, as long as they were scientific explanations?
Correct.
Okay, very good. Now, just to encapsulate that. And so then, if we were to adopt the two recommendations on 4A and 6A that the committee is suggesting here, then we're saving 8 to 9 instructional days.
Well, we had saved 8 to 9 instructional days in our original language to now reintroduce something about the complexity of the cell and to reintroduce something about the origin of DNA. We're adding some days back, but we're not adding 9 days back.
Okay.
By leaving out the evaluate.
Okay. Do you have an estimate, or what's your best figure that you can come up with regard to, if we use the term evaluate in both of those, in both 4A and 6A, how many additional instructional days are we requiring teachers if we adopted in that form?
I really can't answer that. My committee hasn't spoken on that, and obviously I am not a classroom teacher, so I don't have that experience.
Okay, but we would lose
But a limited amount.
Okay, but we would lose some of the instructional days that we have gained by the streamlining process. Correct. If we do that.
Correct.
But in the meantime, we're still allowing teachers to teach both all scientific theories, evolution, otherwise, identify, look at those, compare and contrast those various theories with regard to DNA and the complexity of cells.
Yes.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Ellis, and then Ms. Hart.
Mr. Weatherington, I've got a few follow-up questions on those same two issues there. Let me start with 6A. When we look at the proposal that you sent to us on the letter, you had identify the components of DNA, identify how information specifying traits is carried in DNA, and then identify scientific explanation. I know that evaluation gets us back to where we were, with too many classroom days being required. Identify, as some have talked about, is just simply picking out a lineup. Is there a middle term, something like examine, that you think would fit well in that last part? So basically the last segment would read and examine scientific explanation for the origin of DNA.
Sure. Examine, explore, investigate. Those are all middle term words that are stronger, obviously, than identify. And yet they're not unreasonable. So examine is perfectly fine with my committee.
And just to clarify, going back up to 4A, when you have including scientific explanation for the complexity, you're saying that you're in agreement that is comparing and contrasting scientific explanation for the complexity.
Yes.
And therefore, if we had that standard read, compare and contrast prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, and compare and contrast scientific explanations for the complexity, that might be a little more clear, or at least would be the
Same thing. That's fine.
Thank you.
Dr. Ellis just did exactly what I was going to say.
Okay.
We're fine.
Anyone else? Ms. Hart.
Let me say one thing more. We're aware that there has been, on this little recommendation of ours, there has been a lot of pushback from emails and conversations from individuals and organizations outside, and they all tend to focus on the assertion that removing evaluate is going to jeopardize or constrict students' ability to question scientific explanations. And of course that's absurd. But let's just, for the sake of being devil's advocate, let's just assume that that is true, that removing evaluate is going to challenge the student's ability to do that. So if you remove evaluate from these two, there still remain 9 instances 9 SEs in the biology TEKS that ask for, demand, evaluation. You care to guess how many times that occurs in the other sciences? Chemistry, 3. Physics, 3. IPC, 4. So by the narrow criterion, this narrow criterion for academic inquiry, biology is way ahead already. And those who are concerned with this silly idea ought to focus more on chemistry and physics than on biology. But of course that's absurd also, isn't it? So what I want to say is that when the 10 of us on the committee agreed to this letter, agreed to this recommendation, including one member who is a fellow at the Discovery Institute, it becomes obvious that there were no ideological underpinnings to our recommendations, that we didn't see some magic meaning in the word evaluate.
My name is Ide Trotter. My degree from A&M was followed up by a PhD from Princeton in the Department of Chemical and Biochemical Engineering. I'm here to testify in support of the board's TEKS proposals and argue that any attempt to delete evaluate is totally out of step with evolutionary understanding and the scientific method. First, as I've testified here previously, and no other testimony has successfully contradicted, there is no understanding as to how life first originated from inner molecules. More importantly, for the biology TEKS, accumulating evidence and analysis in the peer-reviewed literature has continued to undermine the once dominant notion that random material processes might possibly explain the diversity of life. Time permits only a brief reminder that since the challenge first laid down by MIT mathematicians at the 1966 Wistar Conference, most postulated support for the so-called modern synthesis has collapsed or been overridden. The rise and fall of junk DNA, abandonment of the monolithic tree of life, recognition of orphan genes with no familial relatives, and finally, epigenetics. Full presentation of this disarray in evolutionary theory is beyond the scope of high school science instruction, but that does not justify degrading the TEKS to conform to an outdated, half-century-old, and anti-scientific misunderstanding. To suggest removing encouragement for students to evaluate at a level appropriate to their background and consistent with the material they are studying, all prepared in conformance with the TEKS, is not just an assault on the scientific method, it contradicts material already in some of the best high school texts, and been there for almost a decade.
Thank you, Dr. Trotter. Is there any questions? Thank you so much. Oh, I'm sorry, Ms. Rell.
Dr. Trotter, I assume you, thank you, by the way, for your work as well and your effort in helping us to get to a good place on these science standards. I assume you heard Dr. Wetherington's testimony in response to, I think, the questions from Member Ellis about use of the term examine, analyze. What's your sense about that if we were looking for a middle ground that balances instructional time, instructional demands with my inclination, for example, that teachers have the freedom to teach both sides of scientific explanations, including evolution?
As long as there's clear understanding that the teachers have the flexibility, I would have no problem with that.
Evaluating different explanations of how things occurred or came to be is a central part of the scientific practice. Rather than being avoided, it should be encouraged. The goal is to teach the scientific method, not the dogma of the day, or only surface information.
I think it's critically important that we balance teaching facts, of which there are an enormous number, with teaching students the scientific method, the wonder of discovery, the opportunity to explore, and to learn the process, not just learn the end product. And so I would urge you to not remove the evaluative requirements in TEKS if it's a question of time. Happily, I went back and looked at several of the textbooks that I was involved in reviewing in 2013, and they're doing a pretty good job now of actually incorporating that. If you look at the Origin of Life section, for example, in Miller and Urey's textbook, they actually have a whole series of questions there that are designed to ask the student to do that kind of evaluation. Let me give you a simple example. The Miller-Urey experiment, when it was originally done, it was done with some gases. It produced some simple building blocks such as amino acids. But the critical question was, how did we know that the gases they used in the experiment were the right ones? And the answer is, they didn't use the right gases. And for 40 years we taught in textbooks that the Miller-Urey experiment was a clear indicator of how amino acids and other things were made. Where finally today, many years later, that's been corrected.
Sir, can you wrap up your final thought on that?
Yeah, well, let me simply say that I really would urge you to leave evaluate in there.
I've heard tell that biology committee considered this board to have run roughshod over committee hearings in the past. Well, let's look at the facts. For 20 years, the TEEPs were to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of scientific theories. And then in 2009, we were prohibited from discussing the weaknesses of evolution. And now we're talking about doing away with the idea of evaluating in the classroom. The trend is obvious. Roughshod, I think not. Silly ideas, I think not. Isn't it curious? I thought that the whole idea of education was to ask questions, to consider alternative viewpoints, and to probe for the truth. Now, why would the evolutionist want us to not evaluate alternative theories? Could it be that the evolutionary theory could not withstand serious scrutiny? Let me suggest that that is the case, and that evolution is a myth. And that the evolutionist, for an evolutionist, is a religious philosophy. There's not a shred of evidence that one species evolved from another. Darwin admitted as much. Jonathan Adler of Newsweek magazine, not a conservative think tank, said the more that paleontologists seek for the transitional fossil, the more frustrated they become. Evolutionists believe that life came from non-life and that we became here by random chance. It takes more faith to believe in evolution than what is obvious, that we are here by design. I would like to suggest we get back to the essence of science, which is skepticism.
Okay. I'm just a mom of 2 Houston Public High School students. I am a former NASA engineer, middle school math teacher, science teacher. Our family had the opportunity to live overseas briefly recently, where I was a board member for the international school there. So I do have an understanding of streamlining procedures and the time and work involved. So I thank you guys very much for doing that. I'm also familiar with both the importance of good science and maintaining a standard of excellence in education. When people ask me why I quit my job at NASA, I tell them that children are more complicated systems than space shuttles. And it's a much harder job, believe me. It is my hope that the board will keep their recommended language for TEEPs 4A and 6A, which allow for the evaluation of scientific explanations for the complexity of prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells and the origin of DNA. What concerns me is as science progresses, the Darwinian theory of origin of life is coming more and more into question. Its mechanisms of natural selection and probability do not always apply. Even the Miller-Urey experiments are becoming increasingly controversial among scientists. Without the need to evaluate, students might not be exposed to possible shortcomings of that theory or any theory. As a parent, I desire my children to maintain a quality education, and by exploring and evaluating differing scientific viewpoints on evolution, it teaches them critical thinking and engages them in the practice of scientific inquiry. To enable students to practice good science, they need to be able to evaluate. Comparing and contrasting are excellent logic tools, but evaluation teaches students how to reason to write conclusions. In my experience as an educator, evaluating scientific evidence fosters learning, engages students, and is not too difficult for them. In my experience as an engineer, avoiding the evaluation of ideas hinders progress.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Witt. with Discovery Institute Dallas. I'm in Sue's district, that funny horseshoe-shaped district in Waco and Denton. I'm here to urge that you, particularly in 6A, the biology standards, that you strengthen that word. I think identify was suggested. I feel a little bit like my job is already done here because I think Ron very flexibly said, we can go with another word. For me, identify might encourage teachers and students just to have their kids just identify, regurgitate what the theory is, but I'd love to see them go deeper. Walter Bradley talked about wanting to, when he was young, he briefly got turned off of biology because all it was regurgitating the facts. I think we'd go deeper, and I think 6A and 4A are both touching on the origin of life, the origin of DNA, and that's a particularly fascinating area. Even the biology textbook for Texas, one of the subheadings is the mystery of the origin of life. And so, later it kind of papers that mystery over a little bit, but even there in that subheading, it concedes there's a huge mystery. Let me quote James Tour. He is a giant in the field. He was named Science of the Year by R&D Magazine, ranked one of the top 10 chemists in the world over the past decade. Here's what he had to say about the origin of life field. Those who think science to understand the issues of prebiotic chemistry are wholly misinformed. Nobody understands them. Maybe one day we will, but that day is far from today. It would be far more helpful and hopeful to expose students to the massive gaps in our understanding. Leslie Orgel of the Salk Institute, he's a giant in the origin of life field, and by the way, very committed to trying to find some sort of evolutionary explanation. He said, one must recognize that despite considerable progress, the problem of the origin of the RNA world is far from being solved. And by the way, the RNA world hypothesis is the one that our biology textbooks kind of at the end says, this may be the leading theory. And here's this world-class leading origin of life researcher saying, that's got huge problems. Let's make sure students have a chance to evaluate, maybe investigate is the best word, and see that. That opens a door to get them curious about science. There's unsolved problems. Thanks.
Yes, Mr. Ellis.
Mr. Wood, thank you for being here today. And as you mentioned, Mr. Weatherington had some thoughts also, but I just want to hear specifically directly from you, going to 6A, if that last clause said to examine scientific explanations of the origin of DNA, your thoughts on that examine wording as somewhere in between identify and evaluate?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that there's time to evaluate. It sounds like some of the committee members, for that word, that triggers for them a sense of we've got to dive deep. They keep talking about 9 days. My sense from talking from some biology teachers, some retired, some current, you can take a half a day to evaluate some of these theories, or you can go much longer. If because maybe that word feels loaded to some of the committee members, it seems to put a weight, then maybe a word like investigate. Examine seems a little weaker to me, but it's light years better than identify. Identify doesn't have any sense to me of kind of digging in and comparing and contrasting, looking at some of the weaknesses. So I'm urging that we move beyond that identify term to something stronger.
Any other questions? Yes,
Follow
Mr.
up on
Ellis,
that.
go ahead.
Also on 4A, where we had discussed having compare and contrast prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, including scientific explanation for complexity. To clarify that, say compare and contrast prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells and compare and contrast scientific explanations for the complexity. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that clarification I think is important because the way that sentence is phrased now, and I understand how these sentences get put together in committee. I used to be an English professor, and so I could go through these and say, that's not a very beautiful sentence. That's not, well, it's a committee work sentence. It's tough not to be that way, but I think that would be a very important clarification because otherwise it's not clear that comparing and contrasting is to be applied to the theories. But if you add that clarification and repeat the term, it's crystal clear.
Thank you.
So that'd be a good one.
Yes, Mr. Rowley, and then Mr. Mercer.
Yeah, Mr. Witt, you're surely not taking the position now, are you, that after we voted at our last meeting to reinsert the number of standards that had been deleted originally, that teachers are precluded from being able to teach both sides of evolution at this point. Are you? Don't you agree that we've made progress in that regard since
Yeah,
the review?
there's been, very good progress.
And so my second...
It's about the origin of life is my main concern.
Right, and the complexity of cells, right?
Right.
That was added as well.
Yeah.
And so, as Mr. Ellis alluded to, and as we talked to, I think, with Mr. Trotter and Mr. Weatherington, Dr. Weatherington, who are two, I mean, Dr. Trotter as well, sorry, two members of the committee, that they were okay with the term examine particularly instead of maybe identify or define. Do you believe that that would then give teachers, biology teachers, sufficient covering, if you will, or even direction to teach both the strengths and weaknesses of evolution, or to look at all sides of scientific theories in those particular topics? You're not saying
that's a
written.
great question, because it brings up one of my chief concerns, and that is making sure that the teachers do have that sense of cover, that freedom.
Right, and that's my question.
And I do think examine is a definite improvement over identify.
Yeah, I heard you say that with regard to Mr. Ellis, but my question to you is, if we write those standards, if they're adopted essentially in the form that we're talking about, that's currently before us, and we use the term examine maybe instead of identify or define, then at that point, the Texas biology teachers have sufficient freedom and in fact direction to teach all sides of scientific theories, including evolution. Simple question.
I hope so, I think so.
Good, that's all I need. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, Mr. Mercer.
Just to follow off the same line, the words examine, evaluate, investigate, identify, which word, what is the word that all sides would agree is the right? Again, examine, evaluate, identify, investigate. What is the best word terminology?
My favorite word is evaluate, but obviously, we have our different favorite favorites
Any other
here.
questions?
Investigate, I like that one. But if we come out of here and we have examine instead of identify, I think that biology teachers who want to teach, as Marty said, strengths and weaknesses, they're going to be able to point to that and say, hey, I went in with these kids and we examined these different theories, and they have some holes in them, they have some weak spots, the different defenders of the different theories, the RNA world hypothesis, the protein first, they each provide some very powerful critiques of the other, and so we're examining those, and so we're going to bring those to light to our students. I'm doing what the text calls for.
Any other questions?
One last question, Mr. Whitman. Again, the complexity of cells, which Mr. Rowley said, we have it back in there. Are there any concerns about that?
Just on, was it 4A?
Yeah.
Just on 4A, that clarification where you repeat the word compare and contrast. I think that's very helpful.
Good morning. My name is David Walls, and I'm the Director of Operations for Texas Values. We're a statewide nonprofit organization dedicated to standing for faith, family, and freedom throughout Texas. And thank the board once again for the opportunity to testify, and just want to thank the board and everyone that's done so much hard work on this streamlining process, and just in general for the work that y'all do. Today I speak on behalf of thousands of our grassroots activists and supporters across the state, including many teachers and parents that have contacted the board in the last several months regarding their concerns over potential changes to the science biology TEKS. We have continued to strongly encourage the board to ensure that the streamlining process of the TEKS did not fundamentally change or undermine the strong biology TEKS that were adopted in 2009 that protected critical discussion and open debate in the classroom on all scientific subjects and theories, including evolution. We supported the tentatively adopted changes from your last meeting and believe that that compromised language honors the approved TEKS. We would oppose, though, further changes that would seek to strip out the word evaluate and replace with identify from standards 4A and 6A. Learning how to evaluate scientific explanations is a key skill needed by our students. Preserving the word evaluate is important to ensuring students and teachers are able to have critical discussion and open debate on concepts regarding evolution and the origin of life. In closing, we just want to continue to ensure that the streamlining changes honor the TEKS as approved in 2009, and we believe that the wording that was adopted in the January-February meeting should be preserved. Thank you.
Any questions? Ms. Harder?
Would you be comfortable with the replacement of the word evaluate with the word exam?
Yeah, as a number of previous speakers, I would say examine is definitely an improvement over identify.
Any other questions? Mr. Mercer?
Sure.
Thank you. And it was originally, as an evaluated.
Let's get the question.
Well, it is a question. You have to, originally it was evaluate and
Right.
identify. You're saying identify and examine?
I can't hear you.
I'm sorry. Ken Mercer, I'm asking the question. Originally it was identify and evaluate. You're saying identify and examine would be appropriate, be acceptable? No? No?
Well, I mean, I'm saying our preference would be to use evaluate that was in the proposed changes from the last meeting.
To identify and evaluate would be the preference? No?
I'm sorry. The preference would be to keep evaluate in 4A and 6A, which was, I believe, what was approved at the January-February meeting.
But the word examine would be acceptable as a replacement?
It would be, I think it would be an improvement over some discussion about removing evaluate and going with identify. I think instead of identify, examine would be an improvement, but as was discussed earlier, I think investigate was another word that was suggested. I think overall there was a consensus that that identify was not strong enough, and I think evaluate would be the strongest.
Okay, thank you, sir.
My name is Doran Robb. I'd like to comment on 4 of the suggested changes. The first one was struck out, analyze and evaluate evidence regarding formation of simple organic molecules and their organization into long complex molecules. This shouldn't be struck out, I don't think, because we do have plenty of good information on that, which can be shared even at the high school level. My wife and I do educational videos, and we wrote an AP episode of our classroom supplement series to assist with this. We should have that. The second one is to analyze and evaluate, critique scientific explanations and so forth. High school students have no proficiency to critique scientific explanations, and neither do many of their teachers. As we have heard in admitted testimony earlier today, the invitation to do this critique is meant to encourage teachers to defeat their own purpose by denigrating science and promoting pseudoscience like intelligent design creationism. I wrote a book detailing this, and this board has mentioned that book many times. The fourth line, compare and contrast prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells and evaluate explanations of their complexity, and I think any discussion of their complexity should include reference to endosymbiosis and the fact that eukaryotic cells incorporate bacteria and are susceptible to accidental horizontal gene transfer and other incidental conditions. For more information, see my classroom supplement video on the origin of symbiotic in organelles. And then finally, evaluate evidence of abrupt sudden appearance and stasis in the fossil record. I think to teach either of these is misleading and no longer phylogenetically or geologically accurate. Instead, the most that could be said is that there are 1 or 2 periods of profound proliferation due to the opening of new environments, but that both of these show apparent precursors in previous periods. If we teach trends within evolution, we should teach the natural laws specific to that field. And again, I have a video detailing some of these.
Thank you so much.
I'm a Texas science educator, and of course I'm familiar with the science standards of our state, as are the board members here, and some have heard the science standards debate in detail for years. Here are a few concerns I have with changes to the science standards. Maybe you remember the phrases, teach both sides or teach the controversy, which was closely related. I know one side was the theory of evolution, which has withstood relentless scrutiny for more than 100 years, but what was the other side of both sides? Because it is never spelled out, only insinuated. I've also heard during the testimony, board member Rowley saying both sides. So, but now we're here seriously considering adding all sides to examining all sides of scientific evidence to our science standards. Just as there is no
competing scientifically testable explanation, much less multiple explanations other than atomic theory for the composition of matter. There's no other scientifically testable explanation for biodiversity and evolution. Setting a task for students to examine all sides of the scientific evidence, especially if all the evidence points to one side, is a fool's errand. I propose a task for the board to consider. If they think examining all sides of scientific evidence is worthwhile, setting aside for a moment if there's even more than one scientific explanation for evidence. If the board can come up with just one other side, or scientifically testable explanation that explains evolution better than the theory of evolution, then include that task in the TEECs. Let's have a look at the failed explanations of the past first. Two are being proposed as additions: the complexity of the cell, 7b. This is a remnant of a former TEEC where evolution was somehow insufficient to explain the complexity of the cell. I think that having this as a TEEC is redundant. There are several TEECs on biological cells and examining them in detail. Do we ask students to talk about the complexity of body systems, like the reproductive system? I think it's just backdoor way to get into intelligent design.
If you'll just give us your final wrap-up thoughts, that'd be great.
Okay. Respect the hard work of scientists, science teachers, and science advocates that the board has heard many times before. Don't undermine it with nitpicky standards.
Any questions? Thank you so much.
First, let me apologize for my casual dress today. My business clothes got left in the closet in the rush to get out of the house yesterday, so I was on the biology committee streamlining, and I do approve of the use of the word examine in replacing identify in 6A. I'm okay with the language of 4A as it stands. But this board would rightly question what all the fuss has been over the text dealing with evolution. Obviously, there is a need to be accurate, but even with this necessary goal, there's another underlying concern that has been highlighted by many in academia concerning how evolution and science in general ought to be perceived. Harvard evolutionary biologist Richard Lewontin made a startling admission when he reviewed Carl Sagan's final book, The Demon-Haunted World. At the end of Lewontin's review, he said, "We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door." That's not science, that's philosophy. Our teachers are not trained to notice these subtleties, and most PhDs in science also have no training in the philosophy of science, and we all need help. Instruction in evolution in our public schools needs to consistently avoid this commitment to materialism. This would reveal a religious bias towards materialism that must be avoided, so my concerns have not only been about accuracy, but in keeping our biology instructional neutral in this critical area.
Yes.
Well, I want to do my standard thank you to you and all the others. And, you know, once this is over, we're going to miss you guys. We've been seeing you every other month. And, but thank you for just working on the panel and maybe coming to something that we might all agree on.
Thank you, Dr. Bull.
I'm Kathy Miller, president of the Texas Freedom Network. You all are getting written testimony, so in the interest of streamlining, I'm not going to read it. I just have 3 points to make. I am grateful, hopeful, and concerned. Grateful to, as you all have expressed, to the teachers and experts on your review team for science. And I want to point out how incredibly responsive the biology review team has been. at the end of the January meeting, I was really concerned. Changes were made kind of at the last minute, stuff that I talk to you guys about all the time. But I love that that committee came back together and they talked about the changes you made, and they heard you, and they came forward with a recommendation. So I'm grateful to them for doing that, and I'm hopeful that you all will accept that recommendation from the folks that you have appointed to be your reviewers. I'm a little bit concerned because I am hearing compromise language, and that team has not been consulted, although a few members of that team have spoken to you today. So I'm really here to say, again, as always, right, listen to your experts who you appoint, the teachers and the experts who you have identified to help you through this process, and beware of last-minute compromises that don't engage those very people who you have trusted through this process. And please, 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 as a mom of 2 students who have made it through science in public school all the way, I want to say, keep in mind that the TEKS under no circumstances silence a student's ability to ask a question or student debate or exploration, and streamlining in no ways withholds the possibility of teachers to go further or do more. In fact, it opens the possibility that they can, based on student interest and the changes that happen so frequently, particularly in the sciences. So that's all I have to say today. Thank you all very much.
Any questions for Ken? Thank you.
Thank you.